It must be somewhat repetitive to hear by now, but the fact remains that gacha games dominated Japan's video game market in less than half a decade. Companies discovered the lucrative formula by synthesizing gambling mechanics from gashapon capsules, traditional card games, and MMOs, then integrating them into social games that flourished on mobile phones and computer browsers. This approach targeted a generation of younger players unfamiliar with the risks, catching regulators and society off guard in the process. The expansion of gacha games beyond Japan did not happen overnight. Instead, it unfolded gradually through word of mouth on emerging online forums and image boards, where curious foreign players glimpsed upon these unusual titles. More often than not, they were dismissed as yet another eccentric Japanese phenomenon, much like other cultural exports from the same region. But in truth, these odd games proliferated rapidly. Less than a year after the breakthroughs of Puzzle and Dragons and Monster Strike, several new titles surged into the scene, each building on the established trends with their own innovations or iterations. These games achieved varying degrees of success, but collectively solidified gacha as a dominant model. From this point onward, speaking about every single gacha game becomes incredibly difficult. There are so many of them, and not all are relevant. Because of this, I have tried my best in compiling a list of the most impactful ones and organized them in specific niches that link them together, whether due to their history, developers, genres, or even my own personal experience playing them. Everything to make for a cohesive narrative. And as a disclaimer, I will attempt to be as unbiased as possible when discussing these games. It may be a bit late to mention it, but these videos aren't made to generate outrage or praise about gacha games, but rather create a context for players that don't know what they are or don't understand the discourse around them, to decide on their own volition if that's a type of video game they will enjoy, and for those familiar with them, to look back at their history and hopefully realize how they got to where they are now. To set the record straight on where I stand, game companies are businesses. What is best for them isn't always what is best for the customer. But I will repeat myself. Video games are a diverse medium, and it will be pretentious to think every game and its features aren't made with different intentions by people with different views. There is always a separation between developers and executives. Speaking plainly, there are no objectively perfect video games, and it is my belief that you could find the so-called soul in even the most predatory gacha game. It must be the case if video games are to be thought of as an art form. With that foundation established, it is worth turning to 2014 and 2015, years that birthed what many players regard as the old guard of gacha games. These titles may sound familiar from somewhere, perhaps from news outlets or the rising fame of their developers, even infamous anecdotes that have circulated widely. Regardless, they achieved success on their own terms and garnered enough international notoriety to transcend Japan's borders, prompting companies to start considering global releases. Among these early standouts, two games immediately deserve attention: Granblue Fantasy and Fate Grand Order. While turn-based RPGs are hardly revolutionary, these two became the most enduring and visible representation the genre has in the space. There also exists a kind of chicken and egg dilemma around gacha games because of them, as it is challenging to determine whether the flood of similar titles that followed were directly inspired by them, or if they drew from earlier influences in the broader JRPG landscape. The reality likely lies somewhere in between, but that distinction matters less than their lasting impact. Granblue Fantasy is an original property developed by Cygames. It retains faint traces of its origins on the mobile browser platform, recalling the times of social gaming constraints. In contrast, Fate Grand Order is a licensed adaptation of the sprawling Fate franchise by Type Moon. It presents itself and plays like a downgraded mobile port of a console game of earlier generations. Yet, it emerged as one of the first gacha games to achieve explosive global success. Both emphasize strong narrative drives, creating intricate stories that unfolded over years. However, their legacies extend far beyond storytelling. They are steeped in complex online lore and rumors, a blend of legitimate milestones and exaggeration. Ultimately, these games served as launching points for trends that later gacha titles would refine, for better or worse, shaping game mechanics and communities around them. To delve deeper on the matter, focusing first on Granblue Fantasy as a case study will be appropriate, as it exemplifies both the strengths and notorious pitfalls of gachas, not as a condemnation, but a reflection of how mobile titles have evolved over time, and the baggage carried by their services when they last for a long period of time. After the maturation of Japan's mobile ecosystem and following the success of Cygames' earlier hits like Rage of Bahamut and the Idol Masters Cinderella Girls, the studio had solidified its place alongside partners like Dina, Mobage's parent company. They honed their expertise in online services with other, smaller games, balancing engaging content with more profitable microtransactions. Anticipation built steadily after Cygames announced their next big project in November 2013. It was to be a new RPG for the same Mobage platform. During the reveal, they highlighted a star-studded voice cast and inspirations drawn from epic fantasy traditions. Producer Yuito Kimura described it as the culmination of their ambition to craft a game with a top-notch lineup. Dina's director at the time, Kenji Kobayashi, joined in hyping the project, quoted as being surprised at the ambition and scale the developers had achieved. The game's influences are evident from the outset. That word, fantasy, carries a profound weight in gaming history, and Cygames leaned into it by recruiting important personnel that had worked on Square Enix's storied catalog. Hideo Minawa, a veteran artist who contributed to Final Fantasy since its fifth installment and directed art for mainline entries, was chosen to handle character designs. His work infused the roster with vibrant personality, echoing the stylized charm of classic Squaresoft titles of old, while maintaining consistency even when crossovers were involved, a feat very uncommon in mobile gachas where visual cohesion is often not a priority. But visual appeal alone will not suffice. To elevate the experience, Cygames reunited Minawa with legendary composer Nobuo Uematsu, responsible for some of Final Fantasy's most iconic soundtracks. Uematsu served as sound director and even lent his own voice, ensuring the score resonated with fans of the classic JRPG genre. Development extended beyond the initial timeline, pushing the launch to March 10, 2014. Upon release, players accessing via Mobage accounts encountered a visually splendid world, with sweeping vistas, a soundtrack consisting of orchestral music with subtle Irish folk motifs conjuring feelings of adventure, and full voice acting that breathed life into the narrative. These elements lent the game airs of legitimacy, distinguishing it from contemporaries hampered by budget or hardware constraints of the past. But this polished facade masked another truth. As a gacha game, Granblue Fantasy not only was engineered for immersion, but also for financial sustainability. Cygames channeled their previously accumulated knowledge of operating live services and transformed that engagement into a consistent revenue stream. That's because, at its heart, Granblue Fantasy offers a straightforward yet captivating loop that has remained largely unchanged for over a decade. Players assume the role of a young protagonist thrust from a humble village into a sky-faring odyssey amidst one conflict after another, accompanied by a diverse ensemble embodying classic anime archetypes, with a story that unfolds through an ever-expanding main arc, character-focused fate episodes, side quests, and seasonal events, a structure that fostered investment, rewarding progression with even deeper lore and interpersonal drama between characters. In between the visual novel styled exposition, actual gameplay alternated between exploration and combat. Quests unfolded in linear scenes where players gathered treasure and consumables, leading into battles reminiscent of Rage of Bahamut, with 4 characters arrayed in a line, selecting from basic attacks, skills or summons. It starts deceptively simple, but goes on to reveal layers of complexity involving elemental affinities, the protagonist being able to swap from a diverse selection of classes, and other MMO-inspired grinds for upgrading characters, weapons, summons, and an expansive weapon grade that replaces traditional individual character gear, all trying to harken to the spirit of the classic JRPG. This depth encourages optimization and skill expression, appealing to players enthusiastic for strategy, yet it also introduces barriers. The weapon grid demands meticulous planning, and summons add another dimension of rarity and synergy, turning what could be routine encounters into some kind of a puzzle of resource allocation, inevitably leading to the gacha system, the genre's defining and divisive feature. In Granblue Fantasy, poles and banners are named draws, a nomenclature borrowed from predecessors like Tanken Drillend and Dragon Collection, though this was the first time it was localized officially in any way. Banners vary in flavor, but definitely take inspiration from Puzzle and Dragon's elemental themes and Cygames' own Rage of Bahamut's card gacha. Nevertheless, it came with a distinctive twist. New characters arrive bundled with unique weapons to use in the aforementioned grid, occasionally giving priority to gear over the character itself, and summons shared relatively simple rarity tiers with them, going from rare, super rare, and SSR, with anything below SSR often treated as expendable fodder. And all of these draws or pulls consume crystals, the actual currency of value players grinded for. Premium currency was named MOBA coins from its legacy roots, rebranded as Granblue coins on iOS and Android. Monetization changed organically, layering innovations on top of what was proven, making use of free daily draws with the most basic in-game currency, event tickets, and continuous login rewards to ease players into the gacha. But you also had limited time banners that amplified urgency even more, with seasonal themes, alternate skins, and collaborations integrated seamlessly into the lore, all becoming a staple that sold exclusivity. These mechanics, while innovative, undersold the predatory undertones that are inherent to gacha design. And let's not forget Granblue Fantasy's multiplayer element that further served to distinguish it, drawing different ideas from MMOs, having raids and guild-based events accessible when joining crews that tested coordination between players and their investment levels. This high difficulty content that demanded precise teamwork fostered subcultures around optimization, spawning spreadsheets that dictated builds, individual member performance tracking, and even blacklists. What initially sounded like collaborative fun devolved into obligation and burnout, with guild wars transforming the game into a competitive grind. For many, the shift from casual play to commitment that feels like a second job marked a tipping point that could only be seen in fully fledged MMOs. At launch, these features earned acclaim alongside the game's flawless presentation, for a game in such a limiting platform, though it trailed behind Puzzle and Dragons and Monster Strike when it came to its initial traction, reaching just over 1 million players by late 2014, making it a bit of a slow burn at first, but its charismatic characters, storytelling, and escalating challenges built a dedicated base that swelled to 10 million active users by the start of 2016, but having religiously dedicated players that are willing to spend vast amounts of money on your game can have unexpected consequences when they think they've been wronged, and Cygames will find themselves in the middle of one of the largest misunderstood controversies to ever grace the industry, let alone just gacha games. The new year is a period in gacha games that brims with incentives like free polls and holiday bonuses to harness all the festive cheer around the occasion. Wanting to instill an even more exclusive feel to the limited characters released at this time, Cygames created special characters based on the Chinese zodiac, the 12 Divine Generals, exclusive to annual gacha banners. For 2016's Year of the Monkey, Andira was chosen as its representative, headlining the event at the start of January. At the time, players assumed these characters might vanish permanently after their year's worth of gala appearances was over, inflating the pressure to summon them immediately. But the race to obtain such a character was more intense than ever, with the user base growing exponentially larger in comparison to the prior year. Tensions were high, and peaked suddenly when reports started surfacing. Players depleted their precious crystal savings, funneling thousands into polls. Some infamous cases exceeding 700,000 yen, and still failed to secure Andira. But those were just the tip of the iceberg, as some reportedly spent over 800,000 yen during the raid-up period. The outrage stemmed from Cygames advertising a 3% SSR rate, doubling it to 6% during galas. But this lacked any other type of transparency on featured rate-up odds, leading to players reverse engineering them to approximately 0.05% with limited empirical testing. This discrepancy led users to claim the rate-up is a lie, fueled by loss aversion and suspecting Cygames themselves of manipulation. Outrage escalated further. In what seemed to echo 2012's complete gacha scandal, complaints started flooding the Consumer Affairs Agency, or CAA, once again. By mid-January, a petition garnered over 2,000 signatures, started by another outraged player that had spent over 100,000 yen. And on February 19th, a CAA spokesperson hinted at potential action after commenting, "It will take action if it was necessary." Once again, potentially inducing industry-wide anxiety from their prior intervention. Affected parties took this opportunity to air their grievances about Crossfade episodes and Granblue's targeting of minors in their advertisement, not being afraid to invoke the complete gacha regulations when sharing their reports with the CAA. Cygames responded officially on February 25th, waiting long after January was over. Before that, they had offered refunds for players in crystals on the 8th of that same month, according to reports. Cygames was now promising to implement a full disclosure page for gacha probabilities, eliminating any kind of ambiguity. But even more transformative was the now new Spark system, a mechanic that put a hard limit to what players needed to spend for the featured SSR. Each draw yields a cerulean spark, and 300 are needed to redeem the prize. But when the banner was over, those sparks did not transfer across banners, with any leftovers being converted to shop currency. This marked gacha's first formal guarantee or pity system, though its high threshold still drew criticism from players. Nevertheless, this fallout reshaped Granblue Fantasy and warped perception around gacha games for many at that time. Planning became viable as saving for sparks rewarded restraint over reckless splurging, and while still demanding in the amount of balls needed to be hoarded, it enables strategic planning without risking complete ruin. However, myths still persist around Monkeygate. During 2016, games like Granblue Fantasy were in no proper legal obligation to advertise their gacha rates in full, but many still cite this incident as the event that completely exposed gacha companies like Cygames as frauds, liars behind the reason why universal rate transparency or pity systems exist in gacha games today. While Cygames did respond to player feedback in kind only a few days after comments from the CAA, it wasn't an admission of guilt, as on June 4th, after a thorough investigation that involved looking into the game's appearance rate settings, the same agency concluded that there were no violations on the Act on Unjustifiable Premiums and Misleading Representations, and no illegal activity of any kind was found. And this was coming from the same agency that had sent the whole industry into a market panic with a single comment on how complete gacha was only, possibly, illegal. However, this time there was no follow-up from the CAA, despite detractors remaining vocal in their calls for further regulation. The Consumer Affairs Agency did not intervene legally at any point that directly related to the event. And that fact marks the beginning of another misconception. Rate disclosure and pity systems in game titles are enforced by Japanese law. Rather, developers do so voluntarily to prevent backlash and not risk reputational damage. Though this also explains why omissions still persist in certain niche or older games. As it will become apparent when gacha games try to break into the world stage, the actual reason this has become normalized isn't because of Granblue Fantasy itself, but due to a much larger player in the world economy that has a strict regulatory arm developers have to follow to the letter in return for access to their market. The rest of the world will follow suit in certain ways that forced game companies to comply. But having said all of that, sparking wouldn't change since Monkeygate. Besides the addition of Vermilion sparks on classic draws sometime in 2022 to account for the large amount of old characters, equipment, and summons that diluted the pool at the time, leaving only an aftermath where pity systems became convention. But that's a story that doesn't concern Granblue Fantasy anymore. A mishandled scandal could have made lesser titles fail, but Cygames' swift action, coupled with sunk cost attachments to the grind, the characters, and their crews, preserved player goodwill. By late 2016, Granblue Fantasy was ported to other Japanese social gaming platforms and browser clients, though the game was still lacking a standalone English version. Cygames decided to address that by instead adding a localization patch in March 2016 that preserved progress for international users playing the Japanese version. Granblue Fantasy went on to evolve into a mobile icon, one that paid homage to Cygames' previous entries like Rage of Bahamut and even the Idol Master Cinderella Girls, notably becoming a cash cow that has birthed non-gacha spin-offs in Granblue Fantasy Versus with Arc System Works and the delayed but ultimately successful Granblue Fantasy Relink, marking one of the few times a gacha game developer and franchise has attempted to test different monetization models and genres. Now, over a decade in on the game's run, its longevity has created a new breed of challenges. Gaps between veterans and newcomers are virtually insurmountable now. Day 1 players boast optimized grids, alongside diverse rosters and ample experience with the quirks of the game, while players starting up face a steep learning curve. Developers have attempted to mitigate this with the inclusion of an academy tutorial that fast-tracks them with resources, starter characters, discounted packs, and even free polls. And on the narrative side, New players can skip a good majority of the main story and still obtain its rewards with a replayable journal to catch up, though barriers still remain for anyone daring to start the game anew right now, stumbling upon outdated interfaces, MMO scale grinds, 300 pull guarantees, and a dense narrative that serve as main deterrents. Many veterans advise against even starting at all, citing a large mismatch between modern expectations and the game's current reality, despite its high production values. Granblue Fantasy is one of the most influential gacha games that are still in service, at least in 2025. While older gachas exist, they're either way too obscure like Dragon Collection or belong to a different game genre like Puzzle and Dragons or Monster Strike. Cygames' magnum opus focused on a traditional genre, the JRPG, which is arguably defining of Japanese video game culture. Its success shaped future gacha games due to the standardization of several conventions like its spark system, banner structure with seasonality, and integration of an ever-expansive narrative, while also focusing on cooperative elements. While no real legal precedent was set in Japan by 2016's incident, other game companies started adopting similar measures, and it is somewhat unlikely that they did so out of goodwill. Though this proves just how vocal players can actually influence a company's decisions when the lid is blown wide open, even if it turns out the rate up was actually not a lie.